In the end, it was not a capital that fell. It was a remote valley no European had heard of. A strip of jungle basin flanked by misty ridgelines in the highlands of northwest Vietnam. There were no palaces, no ministries, no banks, just mud, mosquitoes, and death. But on May 7, 1954, as dusk fell over Dien Bien Phu, the final French radio signal from the fortress said it all in one word: Austerlitz. A name drawn from Napoleon's greatest victory, now repurposed to announce France's greatest colonial defeat. It wasn't just a battlefield that collapsed. It was the illusion of French imperial permanence in Indochina. A few hours later, French diplomats would begin packing for Geneva, and within months, Vietnam would be divided into two halves, each primed for another war. How did it come to this? How did a European power, backed by American dollars and bolstered by elite paratroopers and tanks, lose to a barefoot revolutionary army hauling Chinese artillery through the jungle by hand? And more chillingly, was this truly a Vietnamese victory, or the opening act of a greater Cold War tragedy? To understand the fall of Dien Bien Phu, we must return to 1953 and to a war that, by then, had already dragged on for 7 bloody years. It was called the First Indochina War, but the lines were rarely clear. Was it a colonial rebellion, a communist insurgency, or a proxy war between East and West? For Ho Chi Minh, it was personal. The revolutionary leader had spent decades fighting for Vietnamese independence, first against the Japanese occupiers during World War II, and then against the return of French colonial rule. His Viet Minh guerrillas had grown from a ragtag force in the northern jungles into a formidable army, schooled in Maoist tactics and backed increasingly by Chinese advisors and Soviet ideology. The French, by contrast, were fighting to hold on, not just to Indochina, but to the prestige of a crumbling empire. They called it La Guerre Lointaine, the Faraway War, and by 1953, many in Paris barely remembered why it was being fought. But Ho Chi Minh and his brilliant general, Giáp, did not forget. In 1950, Giap's forces had destroyed French outposts near the Chinese border. In 1952, they ambushed French patrols and pushed into northern Laos. But direct attacks on fortified French positions had failed disastrously, especially at Nha San, where Viet Minh troops were cut down in waves by French artillery. The war had reached a grinding stalemate. Neither side could strike a knockout blow. That was when General Henri Navarre arrived. A career officer newly dispatched from Paris, Navarre was given a hopeless mission wrapped in polite language: find an honorable way out of the war. But honor in war is often spelled in body counts. Navarre knew that a diplomatic solution required military leverage, so he drafted a bold plan: consolidate French forces, abandon isolated outposts, and launch a decisive offensive to break the Viet Minh's momentum. The centerpiece of that plan would be a strategic fortress deep in the jungle, near the Laotian border, designed to bait Giap into a direct fight, one the French believed they could win. The name of that fortress was Dien Bien Phu. From the air, Dien Bien Phu looked like a gift from the gods, a flat valley floor nestled between steep hills, with just enough space to build airstrips and drop in heavy equipment. In November 1953, French paratroopers descended from the sky, seizing the area in a rapid airborne assault. Resistance was light, though not non-existent. Some troops were killed before they even touched the ground. But once secured, the French moved quickly. Bulldozers, artillery, 10 M24 Chaffee light tanks, and even fighter bombers were flown in and reassembled on site. Engineers built bunkers, trenches, and gun pits. A ring of 9 defensive positions named after women was established to protect the base. Navarre envisioned Dien Bien Phu as an air-supplied fortress, able to launch raids against Viet Minh supply lines into Laos. It would be like Nha San, only better this time. The French would be ready, or so they thought. In truth, the position was dangerously flawed. It was 275 kilometers from Hanoi, far beyond the reach of French ground reinforcements. The 2 airstrips were lifelines, but also Achilles' heels. Worse, the surrounding hills were higher than the valley floor and heavily forested. French officers believed these hills were impassable for heavy weapons. They were wrong. By early 1954, Giap had mobilized 50 zero regular troops, thousands of porters, and more than 240 artillery pieces. Some of them captured American howitzers from Korea and begun hauling them up into the jungle hills surrounding the base. French commanders had boasted that no Viet Minh gun would fire 3 rounds without being destroyed. But Giap wasn't aiming for quick volleys. He was building a siege. With guidance from Chinese advisors and an explicit green light to expend as many artillery shells as needed, GAP constructed an intricate network of trenches, tunnels, and supply roads, many of them dug by hand. The Viet Minh moved entire batteries under jungle canopy, invisible to French spotters. By March 1954, the trap had reversed. The fortress designed to bait the Viet Minh had itself become the bait. On the 13th of March, 1954, the silence in the hills broke. What began as probing attacks on the outlying French positions quickly escalated into something far more lethal. At Beatrice, a hilltop bastion manned by the Foreign Legion, the opening barrage was described by survivors as a storm of steel. Trenches collapsed. Bunkers caved in. Radio communications failed. The sky lit with flares, tracers, and a relentless artillery curtain that stunned even hardened veterans. Shells rained down on us like a hailstorm on a fall evening. One legionnaire would later write, "We weren't fighting back. We were simply trying to survive." Within 48 hours, Beatrice fell. 3/4 of the French garrison were killed or captured. The shock reverberated through the camp. Navarre had promised a repeat of Nha San, where isolated French positions had drawn Viet Minh troops into meat grinder battles. But this was different. The Viet Minh had learned. They now used artillery with surgical precision. They blanketed the runways with fire, destroying aircraft and damaging supply lines. And they coordinated infantry assaults with suppression barrages, neutralizing French counter-battery fire almost entirely. At Gabriel, French armor attempted a desperate counterattack, but it too was overwhelmed. Even French fighter bombers couldn't operate freely. Every takeoff, every landing was contested by a web of anti-aircraft fire from the surrounding hills. By the 15th of March, the French artillery commander, Colonel Charles Piroth, who had confidently declared he would eliminate all Viet artillery, quietly walked into his bunker, pulled the pin on a grenade, and took his own life. The myth of French invincibility was gone, and the siege was only beginning. As the situation in Dien Bien Phu deteriorated, desperate telegrams flew from Indochina to Paris, and from Paris to Washington, D.C. The French needed help, not just with supplies, but with bombers. They asked the United States to loan them B-29s to flatten Viet Minh artillery positions. Officially, the planes would be flown by French crews. Unofficially, they needed American pilots. This was no longer a colonial skirmish. It was shaping into a Cold War showdown. In Washington, the debate was fierce. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and Vice President Richard Nixon both supported intervention. Even the use of tactical nuclear weapons had been discussed in hushed tones, but opposition ran deep. General Matthew Ridgway, the former U.S. commander in Korea, warned that intervention would likely trigger Chinese involvement, just as it had in Korea and mire America in another Asian land war. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former general himself, understood the stakes. Publicly, he saw a coalition, perhaps with Britain or other Asian democracies, to lend legitimacy. Privately, he suspected such a coalition would never materialize. In the letter to Winston Churchill, Eisenhower pleaded, "If I may refer again, we failed to halt Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler by not acting in unity and in time. That marked the beginning of many years of stark tragedy and desperate peril. May it not be that our nations have learned something from that lesson?" Churchill's response was tepid. The British public had no stomach for another Asian war. Without British support, Eisenhower backed down. Instead, the U.S. contribution would remain unofficial. 37 American pilots, working for Civil Air Transport, a front company run by the CIA, flew 682 resupply missions into Dien Bien Phu under withering fire. But the weight of the battle stayed on French shoulders, and the Viet Minh were pressing harder. By early April, the French fortress was shrinking. Rain had begun, trenches flooded, supplies dwindled. The Viet Minh, sensing blood, launched the Battle of the Five Hills, striking at Dominique, Elaine, and other key positions. Some French counterattacks succeeded briefly, but at terrible cost. The core of the garrison was now surrounded, cut off, and exhausted. French paratroopers continued to drop in by night, often with no parachute training. One survivor recalled descending under fire. Illumination flares burst around me. Tracers lit up the sky like a holiday. But it wasn't celebration, it was slaughter. French casualties mounted. Morale heureux. By mid-April, the defenders held only a 5-kilometer circle of muddy, cratered land. Supplies dropped from the sky often fell into Viet Minh hands. Desperate to break the siege, the French organized Operation Condor, a relief column from Laos. But monsoon rains and Viet ambushes ground it to a halt. There would be no rescue. There would be no breakout. By early May 1954, Dien Bien Phu had become a place of suffering beyond words. The trenches were flooded. The stench of unburied dead lingered in the humid air. Shells never ceased. Sleep came only in shallow snatches. And even then, dreams were haunted by the sound of incoming fire. Captain Fourreau, one of the last officers to relay orders under fire, recalled moving through the collapsing trenchworks. Mud was up to my chest. The radio operator beside me vanished, probably swallowed by an explosion or drowned. I realized then the end was at hand. In the final hours, Von Nguyen Giap deployed a new weapon, 6-barreled rocket launchers supplied by China, modeled after the German Nebelwerfer used in World War II. They howled across the valley in a last, vengeful storm of steel, targeting the remaining headquarters and outer bastions. The French clung to isolated positions like Isabelle, which had been cut off for weeks. When the final Viet Minh assault came on May 7, it was like the collapse of a dam. Overwhelming, sudden, inevitable. By 6 p.m., the main camp fell. A handful of French soldiers attempted to break out to the south that night. Most were either killed or captured. Only 78 men would make it out alive. The next morning, May 8, as Paris commemorated the 9th anniversary of victory in Europe, A single word was transmitted from Laos to confirm the disaster: Austerlitz. But it was no imperial triumph. This time, Napoleon's ghost was not smiling. The scale of the French defeat was staggering. More than 300 French troops were killed. Over 400 wounded, and 9 taken prisoner. Of those, many would not survive captivity. Estimates of Viet Minh casualties vary. Some say up to 30,000 were killed or wounded. But in the eyes of Ho Chi Minh, it was worth every drop. He had achieved something no other colonial subject had done in modern history, militarily defeating a Western imperial power on the battlefield. France, humiliated and weary, had no stomach for further war. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu broke more than just a garrison. It broke the illusion of French control in Asia. It punctured the myth that modern firepower alone could subdue a determined national liberation movement. In July 1954, world powers gathered in Geneva. There, the Geneva Accords carved up Indochina with the blunt instruments of Cold War diplomacy. Vietnam was split along the 17th parallel. The North would be governed by Ho Chi Minh and the Communists. The South would fall under the nominal rule of Bao Dai, later replaced by the more anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem. Laos and Cambodia were recognized as independent kingdoms. In theory, elections would be held in 1956 to unify Vietnam. In practice, they never would. The United States, alarmed by the rise of communism in Asia and viewing Ho as a puppet of Moscow and Beijing, refused to support the elections. Instead, America stepped in where France had failed, and the Second Indochina War, better known as the Vietnam War, began to take shape. China's game and the Vietnamese cost. Ironically, not all victors of Dien Bien Phu were entirely happy. For China, the victory achieved its geopolitical aims: a buffer zone south of its border, an ally in Hanoi, and crucially, no American invasion. Chinese advisors had pushed hard for a compromise at Geneva, fearing that a unified, victorious Vietnamese communist state might eventually pursue its own national interests, perhaps at the expense of Chinese influence. After all, history had not always been kind between China and Vietnam. So while Ho Chi Minh accepted a divided Vietnam, many in his circle, like future leader Le Duan, were heartbroken. Along the way to the south, Le Duan remembered bitterly. Compatriots came out to greet me. They thought we had won. It was so painful. They had won, but it was half a country and only half a piece. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was over, but the valley did not fall silent. Instead, it echoed across decades, across continents, through the cracked foundations of crumbling empires and the calculating war rooms of Cold War superpowers. France would never again mount a serious colonial campaign in Indochina. In 1956, French troops left Vietnam for good. The cost of their failure: nearly 79,000 dead from the French Union, including 15,000 North Africans, Algerians, and Moroccans who fought in a war many barely understood, on behalf of a flag that would soon abandon them to. The Viet Minh has suffered grievously, perhaps 200,000 dead by war's end. But with victory came legitimacy. Not only in Vietnam, but across a decolonizing world, where leaders from Algeria to Mozambique saw in Ho Chi Minh and Von Nguyen Giap a model of how David could still slay Goliath. And yet, it wasn't a clean victory. The Geneva Accords had created a temporary peace, but peace built on division on the 17th parallel, on promises of elections that never came, only planted the seeds of a larger storm. In Washington, President Eisenhower soon invoked the now famous domino theory, warning that if South Vietnam fell to communism, Other Asian states would follow: Thailand, Laos, Indonesia, perhaps even India. So while France packed his bags, America stepped forward, first with aid, then with advisors, and eventually with combat troops. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was not the end of war in Vietnam. It was a handover from one empire to another. The valley today, memory and meaning. Today, the valley of Dien Bien Phu is quiet. Green hills rise around a broad plain where rice paddies now glisten. Villagers work fields where once artillery shells fell like rain. The bunkers remain. Some are restored, some left to rust, all of them silent witnesses to a war that reshaped the fate of a nation. French cemeteries lie not far from Vietnamese memorials, and students, foreign and local alike, visit the Battle Museum to learn how a distant war fought in the shadows of colonialism and communism became a hinge in global history. It is easy, in hindsight, to view the battle as a foregone conclusion, to praise Giap as a genius and cast Navarre as a fool, but history is never so neat. The truth is more human. A general gambled on a valley he thought was impregnable. Another gambled that sacrifice would yield independence. Both were right and wrong, and in the mud and fire between their ambitions, thousands paid the price. A last reflection, the cost of empire. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of Dien Bien Phu lies not just in its bloodshed, but in its familiarity. An empire overextends. A local force fights for its land. Superpowers circle, whispering promises. And the valley, far from home, becomes the altar where geopolitics demands sacrifice. This is not only Vietnam's story. It is Afghanistan's. It is Algeria's. It is Ukraine's, Syria's, and many yet to come. As one French survivor of the siege recalled decades later, we didn't lose because we were weak. We lost because we thought they were weaker than they were. And maybe, just maybe, that is how all empires fall. Not by the strength of their enemies, but by the blindness of their pride. If you found this documentary compelling, we invite you to subscribe to Legacy Files, where history is not just dates and facts, but the echoes of human ambition, error, and courage. What happened in Dien Bien Phu changed Vietnam and the world, but it also left us with a question still unanswered. If one valley could end a colonial empire, what will it take to end the next?